By the time the intercom used my voice, the thing in Silo 4 had already learned how I breathed. I was standing ankle-deep in wet gray slurry on the silo floor, holding a dead flashlight in one hand and a detonator box in the other, while faces kept pressing out of the cured walls around me like people trapped under a tarp. Some of them I recognized right away. One was Tyler Mays, who had lost his arm in the stamping press back in Ohio. Another was a foreman named Cal I'd only seen in an old black-and-white safety photo. A third face was my own, except the mouth was smiling too wide and the teeth looked packed with cement dust. "Mark," the intercom said overhead, in my exact voice, calm as a voicemail greeting. "You can stop now. Nobody blamed you as much as you did." The gray workers stood around the rim above me, still as fence posts in their dust masks and coveralls. There had to be 30 of them, maybe more. Every one of them was looking down. Then Ron stepped out from behind the bulk material chute with his mask off, though half his cheek was sealed under a skin of pale concrete. "You need to understand," he said, and he sounded almost sorry. "It only knows what you give it." Something below my boots shifted. The whole silo breathed in. I pressed my thumb harder against the detonator switch and heard my own voice on the intercom begin to laugh. 48 hours earlier, I took the night shift maintenance job at Black Hollow Cement because nobody else wanted it, which made it perfect for me. If a place has trouble keeping people, nobody asks too many questions when you show up willing to work nights, weekends, holidays, all of it. They look at the application, see you've got industrial experience, see you're not asking for relocation, and they hire you before they have time to wonder what exactly you're running from. Black Hollow sat outside a town called Mercer's Run, though town was generous. It was mostly a gas station with boarded windows, a diner that closed at 2, a church with a leaning steeple, and rows of old company houses slumping into the hills like they were tired of standing. The factory rose beyond all that in a spread of concrete silos, conveyors, and stacks, with an abandoned limestone quarry opening behind it like a second sky turned upside down. During the day, it looked ugly and ordinary. At night, with the red aircraft lights blinking and the dust hanging low over the yard, it looked like something that should have been condemned years ago and just hadn't gotten the paperwork yet. Officially, I was hired to handle night maintenance. Belts, bearings, motor checks, lockouts, patch jobs, whatever stopped moving when it should move or moved when it shouldn't. Unofficially, I was there because 3 months earlier I had signed my name to a safety inspection I hadn't done. That happened at a different plant in Ohio. I told myself I'd circle back and do the full walkthrough after lunch. Then a vendor came in, then a supervisor wanted me in a meeting, then the line started back up and I let my signature stand. That same week, a guard plate failed on a piece of machinery I'd supposedly cleared. 2 men got hurt. One lost 3 fingers. The other took a hit to the face that left him with steel pins in his jaw. No one proved negligence. The paperwork looked fine. The company lawyers did what company lawyers do. But I knew exactly how close I'd stood to those 2 men and how casual I'd felt while I signed. I lasted 6 more weeks there before every hallway started feeling too narrow. Then I saw Black Hollow was hiring. The manager interviewed me in a small office that smelled like old coffee and limestone dust. His name was Dean Mercer. He was broad through the shoulders, red-eyed, and had the kind of tired politeness you get from people who've spent years dealing with machinery and men in equal amounts. There were framed safety awards on the wall behind him, all at least 10 years old. He skimmed my file, asked me if I had any issues working alone, and hired me in under 15 minutes. Too fast, honestly. When I stood to leave, he opened a desk drawer and took out a laminated card on a steel key ring. It looked like the sort of thing you'd get with evacuation routes or lockout reminders. "This stays on you during every shift," he said. I looked down. There were 7 rules printed in plain black type. Rule 1. Never enter Silo 4 after midnight. Rule 2. If you hear knocking from inside a cement mixer, do not investigate. Rule 3. Do not acknowledge workers wearing gray coveralls. Rule 4. If dust begins falling upward, leave the area immediately. Rule 5. Never answer your name over the factory intercom. Rule 6. If you see wet footprints, follow them only if they lead outside. Rule 7. Do not remain alone in the quarry after 3 in the morning. I remember reading them twice because I assumed there was a joke coming after. There wasn't. Mercer watched my face the whole time. Not smiling. Not trying to sell it as company tradition or hazing or local folklore. Just waiting. I said, "What is this? Some kind of initiation thing?" "No." "Then what happens if I break one?" He leaned back in his chair. There was a fan on the filing cabinet behind him, but it wasn't on. Nothing in the room moved. "That depends on which one," he said. I laughed once because I didn't know what else to do. "Come on." He didn't laugh. "Night shift's different here," he said. "Most of the work is normal. If something strange happens, don't improvise. Follow the card." I turned it over to see if there was anything else on the back. There wasn't. Just scuff marks in the laminate. "Who made these?" I asked. "People who lasted." That should have hit me harder than it did. But at the time I was still thinking like somebody who had spent years in factories, mines, and plants. Every place had stories. Every old site had rumors. You tell new hires not to whistle underground, not to mention certain names on graveyard shift, not to open sealed rooms, not because any of it is real, but because industry breeds superstition the same way it breeds rust. I clipped the card to my belt mostly to humor him. On the way out, I passed the evening shift changing over in the locker room. Men in reflective stripes, dust masks hanging loose at their throats, steel lunchboxes dented from years of use. Nobody looked at me longer than a second except one older guy lacing his boots on the bench by the sinks. He had a long face, nicotine-colored mustache, and forearms roped with old burns. His badge said Ron Haskell. His eyes dropped to the laminated card on my belt. He said, "Mercer gave you the list?" "Yeah." Ron stood up slow, joints cracking. "Then don't get clever." "Wasn't planning to." He gave me a look that said he had heard that before. My first week I learned the plant by flashlight and sound as much as by map. The quarry wind made a low sound through the conveyor supports. The clinker line popped when it cooled. Dust got everywhere, no matter what seals or masks or wash stations you had. In the narrow service corridors between the silos, you could scrape a finger down the wall and come away white. Nothing happened that first night except normal work. Nothing happened the second night either. By the third, I'd already started feeling embarrassed that I had taken the rules seriously enough to keep checking the card. I should say now that fear rarely arrives looking useful. At first it just makes you feel stupid. That was how Black Hollow started with me. Not with terror. With small embarrassment. With the feeling that I'd let a tired manager and a creepy old plant get inside my head. And because I was already the kind of man who ignored warning signs when they were inconvenient, that feeling suited me just fine. The first few weeks at Black Hollow passed quietly enough that I began to think the whole thing was an elaborate filter for new hires. Night maintenance has a rhythm if you stay long enough. You stop thinking of the factory as one place and start thinking of it as zones with moods. The kiln corridor was always hot even when nothing needed doing. The baghouse platform felt hollow under your boots. The silo catwalks were cold and drafty, with wind sneaking through places there shouldn't have been openings. The maintenance shop, with its humming vending machine and corkboard of outdated notices, felt almost normal. Most of my work orders were routine. Grease fittings, belt tension checks, replacing a motor coupling on line 2, clearing a jam in one of the feed hoppers, taking vibration readings, logging temperatures, the kind of tasks that make a shift disappear if you keep your head down. And the rules, ridiculous as they were, turned out to be easy to follow because nothing seemed to test them. Silo 4 stayed locked. The intercom only carried ordinary pages. Forklift requests, supervisor callouts, shift change reminders. I never saw dust falling upward. I never saw wet footprints. I never heard knocking from a cement mixer. And I definitely never saw anybody in gray coveralls. Black Hollow's crews wore either reflective orange vests over dark uniforms or heavy brown work jackets when it got cold. If gray coveralls existed, they belonged to some older era of the plant. That should have ended it. Most people would have laughed about the rules, tossed the card in a locker, and moved on. What kept them alive, at least for me, was how seriously the older workers treated them. Not openly. Nobody made speeches. Nobody gathered around to swap ghost stories. It was smaller than that. A look when the intercom crackled unexpectedly. A man changing direction without comment near the silos. Somebody stepping out of the quarry access road at 2:55 and not waiting to finish a smoke. Tiny corrections in behavior that seemed automatic. Ron Haskell was the clearest example. He had been at Black Hollow long enough that half the equipment probably recognized his footsteps. He worked nights by choice, which I found suspicious from the start. Most people only choose nights if they need the differential or they don't like being seen. Ron fit both possibilities. He showed me where they kept spare couplings, which valves stuck in cold weather, which supervisors would write you up for nothing, and which ones only cared whether the line stayed moving. He could be helpful when he wanted. He could also go dead quiet in the middle of a sentence if he thought you were wasting his time. About 10 days in, I found him in the locker room before shift change, writing in a spiral notebook balanced on his knee. "What's that?" I asked. He shut it halfway. "Nothing." "You writing poetry, Ron?" "Maintenance notes." He said it too quickly. Later that week, I saw the notebook again inside his locker. He had stepped away to take a call or maybe wash up. I only meant to grab my gloves from the next compartment, but the pages were right there. Open. It wasn't maintenance notes. It was a list of rules. Not the laminated 7 from Mercer. More than that. Handwritten. Numbered. Crossed out. Rewritten. With dates in the margins and arrows pointing to corrections. Some matched the official list. Some didn't. Some flat out contradicted it. One line read, "Gray coverall workers are harmless if acknowledged first. Do not let them speak your name." Another said, "Quarry safest after 3 o'clock if you are not alone. Unsafe before 3 o'clock if you are." Then lower down, "Do not trust any list that stays the same too long." I was still reading when Ron came back. He closed the locker so hard it bounced. "You don't touch my things," he said. "Then don't leave your ghost manual open." His jaw flexed. For a second I thought he might actually swing on me. Instead he took the notebook, turned it so only he could see, and said, "Mercer gave you the official version because official versions comfort people." "Comfort them with what?" "Nonsense. With order." I laughed. "You really believe this stuff?" Ron looked past me toward the row of shower stalls. There was nobody there. Water dripped somewhere anyway. "It doesn't matter what I believe," he said. "It matters what notices you." That annoyed me more than anything. The half-answers. The local mystic routine. I had known men in every dangerous industry who built their whole personalities around being the one guy who understood the mountain, the mine, the boiler, the plant. They were exhausting. So I said, "If you know so much, tell me which rules are real." He slid the notebook back into the locker and shut the door carefully this time. "Depends who's watching," he said. Then he walked out. For a while that line stuck in my head because it was exactly vague enough to be irritating. I kept turning it over, trying to decide whether he meant management, security cameras, some prank being played on me, or just my own nerves. Eventually routine won. That happens faster than people admit. You can get used to almost anything if it doesn't hurt you right away. The card on my belt stopped feeling like a warning and started feeling like part of the uniform, same as my radio or lock keys. Some nights I forgot it was there. I started smoking again during breaks, out by the loading bay where the wind cut through the concrete walls. I learned which vending machine buttons stuck. I figured out that the break room microwave took exactly 1 minute and 40 seconds to make terrible coffee hot enough to drink. The place began to feel manageable. Maybe that was the point. Maybe every trap worth stepping into starts by teaching you there's no trap at all. A little after my 3rd week, Ron caught me cutting through the lower mixer bay to save time on a work order. He said, "You're getting comfortable. Is that a crime? Here?" "Usually." I shrugged him off. "Nothing's happened, Ron." His face didn't change, but his eyes did. They went flat the way they had the day I looked in his locker. "That's exactly how it starts," he said. At the time I thought he was trying to scare me back into respecting his private mythology. What I didn't understand yet was that Black Hollow wasn't trying to prove the rules were true. It was doing something smarter. It was letting me prove to myself they weren't. The rule I broke didn't feel like a rule when I broke it. Felt like common sense. That's probably worth admitting. It was near the end of a Wednesday shift, around 4:20 in the morning, and I was finishing up a lubrication check in the lower processing wing. Most of the line had already gone quiet except for the ventilation fans and one slow conveyor feeding residual material through a covered chute. The kind of hour when your body thinks it's either too late to be awake or too early to have any good judgment. The mixer bay sat mostly dark at that time of night. Black Hollow didn't use the drum mixers constantly. Some only ran during specific production windows or for specialty batches. The one nearest me, Mixer 3, had been tagged inactive since before midnight. I knew because I'd checked the lockout myself. I was writing down a bearing temp by flashlight when I heard it. 3 knocks. Soft. Hollow. Distinct. They came from inside the drum. I froze with the pen still against the clipboard. There was a pause, maybe 2 seconds. Then 3 more knocks. Not loud. Not frantic. More like someone rapping their knuckles against a door because they assumed the person on the other side was nearby and just not paying attention. Rule 2 came back to me at once. If you hear knocking from inside a cement mixer, do not investigate. I actually said Jesus Christ out loud, though more annoyed than scared, because once you spend enough time in industrial plants, you develop a second brain that runs on procedure. A noise in locked equipment means something. It means a loose panel, trapped debris, pressure settling, or worst case, a person where no person should be. And if there's even a 1% chance somebody is inside, you check. I remember looking around like maybe Ron would step out of the shadows and tell me I'd passed some stupid test. Nobody was there. The bay smelled like old dust and machine grease. My flashlight beam shook a little because my wrist was tired, not because I was nervous. At least that's what I told myself. I walked to the drum. "Anybody in there?" I called. No answer. I climbed the side ladder, undid the inspection hatch, and shined my light inside. Empty. Not mostly empty. Completely empty. No trapped laborer. No animal. No fallen tools rattling around. The inside surface was clean except for the usual gray residue and scrape marks. I listened. Nothing. I swung the beam across every angle, even crouched to get it deeper into the drum. The light caught the curve of the steel interior and threw it back at me. That was all. I checked the access platform below, the feed opening, the area behind the mixer housing. Nothing. By the time I climbed back down, I was irritated. The kind of irritation that comes from realizing you let a dumb idea control your body for 30 seconds. I stood there another minute waiting for the sound to repeat. Didn't. I finished my log sheet and walked out. That should have been the end of it. In a fair world, maybe it would have been. The next shift came and went with no issue. Then another. I kept half expecting something. A prank. A supervisor asking why I had opened locked equipment. Some sign that I'd brushed up against whatever local game Black Hollow was playing. There was nothing. I didn't get hurt. I didn't see anything unusual. No machinery failures followed. No one mentioned Mixer 3. A week passed. Then another. My confidence hardened in a way I didn't notice at first. I started seeing the rules less as warnings and more as examples of what kind of people worked there before me. Nervous people. Suggestible people. The sort who needed strange little systems to make random danger feel organized. I'd broken Rule 2 and the plant hadn't done a damn thing about it. That mattered to me more than it should have. It scratched something ugly in my brain. The same part that had signed off on that inspection in Ohio. The part that always whispered, you know better than the caution label, the manual, the old-timer, the person telling you to slow down. The part that confuses getting away with something once for understanding it. I didn't tell anyone what I had done. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want Ron looking smug. That's the embarrassing truth. A few nights later, he and I were changing out a coupling on a motor near the south transfer line when the subject of the rules came up again. I don't even remember how. I think the intercom had crackled and gone dead for a second. Ron said, "Most folks make it worse trying to prove they're not scared." I tightened a bolt and said, "Maybe some folks just don't like being lied to." He looked at me across the motor housing. "You hear something you shouldn't?" That hit closer than I wanted, though I don't think he knew exactly how close. "Maybe," I said. And nothing." Ron wiped his hands on a rag. "Nothing right away, you mean?" I almost told him then. I almost said I'd opened the mixer, found it empty, and proved the whole list was a scarecrow. But I held it back because some stubborn part of me wanted the private satisfaction of it. He nodded once like I had confirmed something for him. Black Hollow's patient, he said. That was the first time the factory's name sounded wrong in somebody else's mouth. Not the plant. Not this place. Black Hollow. Like a person you didn't trust. I should have paid more attention to that. Instead I went on with my shift, finished the coupling, and spent the rest of the night thinking about how ridiculous all of them looked. Men in their 40s and 50s obeying a laminated superstition card in a cement factory built next to a dead quarry town. Days turned into weeks. My sense of cleverness stayed. Nothing had happened. That was the trick. Nothing had happened in a way I could immediately measure. So I kept working. Kept sleeping badly in my rented duplex by the road. Kept driving past the quarry at dawn with dust on my boots and the rules clipped to my belt like a joke I was in on. For a while, that was enough for me. Then the factory started collecting faces. The first gray coverall worker showed up on a Monday, and if I hadn't been alone on the catwalk to Silo 2, I might have convinced myself I imagined him. He stood on the platform across the gap, maybe 30 feet away, hands at his sides, body angled toward me. Gray one-piece coveralls. Dust mask. No reflective strips. No hard hat light. Just stillness. I raised my flashlight, and the beam caught him square in the chest. He didn't react. The catwalk wind hissed through the railings. Somewhere below, a drag chain clattered and settled. I remember the very ordinary thought I had. What idiot is up here without reflective gear? Then he stepped backward behind a support brace. I crossed the catwalk fast, expecting to catch a contractor or a trespasser or one of the day shift guys playing around. There was nobody there. No footsteps on the platform dust either. Just the powdery layer every surface collected by the end of a shift and my own boot prints cutting through it. I told myself it had been a trick of light. Easy enough to do when you spend 12 hours staring through suspended dust and sodium lamps. 2 nights later I saw another one down in the packing area. That one stood inside the fenced perimeter of an inactive palletizer, facing outward through the chain mesh. Same gray coveralls. Same mask. Same strange stillness. I stopped so abruptly my tool bag swung off my shoulder. "Hey!" I said. Before I remembered Rule 3, the figure tilted its head a little. Not much. Just enough that something went tight under my ribs. Then one of the line operators rounded the corner behind me, complaining about a jammed label feed. I turned to answer him, literally 1 second, maybe 2, and when I looked back, the fenced palletizer enclosure was empty. "Who was in there?" I asked. The operator frowned. "Who?" "In the cage." He looked through the mesh. "Nobody." I laughed it off, but my mouth had gone dry. After that, the sightings came quicker. A gray worker on the upper conveyor walk, looking down into the quarry. Another standing half inside the open mouth of a maintenance bay, where the shadows made his coveralls seem damp. One reflected in a dark security monitor behind me when the actual hallway was empty. What bothered me wasn't just that they were there. It was that nobody else seemed to notice unless I pointed too directly, and even then the reactions felt wrong. Either they saw nothing at all, or they saw something ordinary and lost interest immediately. A shadow. Contractor. A trick of angles. Ron noticed my attention before he noticed the figures. He found me in the break room one night staring at the security feed monitor mounted over the coffee machine. The image had frozen for half a second on the quarry access gate. In that half second, I counted 3 gray workers standing shoulder to shoulder by the fence. By the time Ron looked up, the feed had refreshed and the gate was empty. "You look like hell," he said. "Not sleeping. That'll do it here." I almost asked him outright then. Instead I said, "Ever feel like there are more people on shift than there should be?" He set his coffee down carefully. "Where'd you see them?" The fact that he didn't ask what made my scalp prickle. "Who says I saw anybody?" "You did." I hated how calm he stayed. "I've seen a few guys in gray coveralls," I said. "No badges. No vests." Ron's face didn't change, but his hand tightened around the foam cup. "Did they see you?" "That's not an answer." "Did they see you?" I thought about the one in the palletizer cage, the way it had tipped its head after I spoke. Maybe. Ron swore under his breath. They're not supposed to come that far in this early. This early. He looked at me then, really looked, as if checking whether something on me had changed. What did you break? He asked. The directness of it made me angry. Nothing. Don't do that, he said. Not here. Nothing happened. He stared at me for another second, then said quietly, That's never true. I walked out before he could keep going. By the end of that week, there were enough gray workers that I stopped trying to convince myself they were isolated sightings. I'd catch them at the edge of platforms, on distant stair landings, behind dusty windows in sealed control booths. Always motionless. Always masked. Sometimes one at a time, sometimes 2 or 3, and once, while crossing the yard between the maintenance shop and the raw mill, I counted 12. The following night, I counted 17. That was also when I started recognizing them. Not clearly at first. Just hints. The slope of shoulders. A particular way someone stood with one foot turned out. The shape of a jaw under the mask. Familiarity that didn't make sense. One of them had Tyler's build. The man from Ohio who lost his fingers after my false inspection. Another had the stooped neck of an old high school friend named Nate who died drunk in a rollover outside Johnstown. Another looked like my father from a distance, broad-backed and quiet, though he'd been dead 6 years and nowhere near cement in his life. The factory wasn't making strangers. It was pulling from inventory. That idea took hold of me slowly and then all at once. Every person I'd failed, disappointed, abandoned, or simply not helped enough seemed to be finding a shape in those gray coveralls. I started dreading reflective surfaces at work. Dark office windows, camera monitors, the stainless sink in the locker room. Once, bent over washing dust off my hands, I saw 2 masked figures standing behind me in the mirror. When I spun around, the room was empty except for dripping pipes and the row of lockers. I stopped smoking outside because the yard felt too open. I stopped taking the silo catwalks alone when I could help it. And still I didn't tell management the truth about the mixer. Partly pride, partly shame, partly because by then I had begun to understand something ugly. If the consequences were connected, then I had invited them. The worst sighting came just before dawn on a Thursday. I was in the old admin corridor, where the framed photos of past plant managers hung under a film of dust. I looked up and saw a gray worker at the far end of the hall under the exit sign. He was shorter than the others, thinner. One sleeve hung empty from the elbow down. Tyler. Or not Tyler exactly, but enough of him that my body knew before my mind agreed. He lifted one hand, the remaining one, and tapped the wall beside him 3 times. Soft, hollow. The sound carried down the hall and into my teeth. Then he turned and walked through a locked fire door without opening it. I didn't move for a long time after that, because by then the false comfort had burned off and left something worse in its place. Not full panic yet, just the beginning of a thought I couldn't put away. Maybe Black Hollow had never been trying to scare me. Maybe it had been waiting for me to introduce myself. Once I started seeing the gray workers everywhere, I needed the factory to make sense again. That sounds cleaner than the truth. Really, I needed a version of events where I wasn't losing my mind and where there was still a problem I could solve by being thorough enough, clever enough, or brave enough. I had lived my whole adult life believing every system, no matter how broken, could still be understood if you found the right paperwork. So I went looking for paperwork. Black Hollow kept decades of records in an old second-floor admin suite nobody used at night. The current office staff had moved into a newer annex years ago, leaving the original rooms mostly for storage, metal shelves, rolled blueprints, union notices from the 90s, accident binders, payroll ledgers in cracked vinyl. The whole floor smelled like paper that had been damp once and never forgiven it. I started with incident reports. At first I told myself I was researching the rules indirectly, looking for workplace hazards that had become superstitions. Fatal falls, confined space accidents, suffocations in silos, the usual industrial ghosts that get turned into stories because management would rather circulate rumors than admit patterns. Black Hollow had enough real accidents to support a dozen legends. A kiln mechanic burned alive in 1987 after a feed flare and secondary ignition. A loader operator slid into the quarry runoff in 1994 and drowned in muddy water less than 4 feet deep because his cab jammed. A contract welder vanished for 8 hours in 2008 and was found wandering the North Hall Road without his gloves or radio, unable to explain where he'd been. Then there was the collapse. I found it in a folder thick with copied newspaper clippings and typed reports on onion skin paper. Before Black Hollow became a cement plant, the site had been a limestone quarry with underground cuts running farther into the hill than the official maps showed. In 1962, a section of the older galleries collapsed during a night blast sequence. The company report said 23 men were trapped. 7 bodies were recovered. 16 were listed as unrecovered due to instability and flooding in the lower chambers. The wording caught me right away. Unrecovered. Not presumed. Not impossible. Just unrecovered. I kept digging. In a separate binder labeled with a supervisor's name, A. Cormac Night Logs, I found handwritten annotations tucked between the formal pages. Not official records. Private notes. Angry ones. Stop sealing the lower access before count is confirmed. Mercer's father says no more names in writing. Dust in the west cut moved against airflow again. They are still knocking. That last line had been underlined so hard the pen tore the paper. I sat back in the chair and listened to the old office settle around me. Even empty, it made sounds. Baseboard ticks. A vent flapping faintly somewhere overhead. The building had the same kind of after-hours noise as every old industrial site, except once you start reading things like they are still knocking, every harmless sound gets more expensive. A locked file drawer on the far side of the room took me another 20 minutes to open with a bent screwdriver and a lot of guilt-driven patience. Inside were payroll ledgers, canceled insurance forms, and, shoved flat under everything else, a black hardbound journal wrapped in a feed sack. No name on it. Just dates spanning different years in uneven bursts. Some entries were signed only with initials. Others weren't signed at all. I'm still not sure whether it belonged to one supervisor or several. The first pages were mostly observations. Rule changes after incidents. Do not let new hires compare lists. Masks help. Not with dust. With recognition. Then the rules multiplied. Some matched Ron's notebook. Some matched Mercer's card. Some contradicted both. If you hear your name on the radio, answer only if you can see who called. Crossed out. Never answer your name on any system after 12 o'clock. Then later, if dust rises, do not run toward doors that were open a moment earlier. Confirm exit is still outside. And again, several pages later, in larger writing, repeated as if the author kept returning to it. Do not let them finish curing. That line appeared 7 times through the journal. No explanation. No subject. Just them. I kept reading. A cluster of entries from the late 70s made my stomach turn. After Stevens fell from the catwalk, 2 more in gray observed from Silo 4 access. Acknowledgement increases persistence. Hostility also increases persistence. Best result is non-recognition, but impossible once similarity begins. They choose from memory when available. Less stable when forced to improvise. New accidents accelerate setting time. That was the first time I understood the factory might not just be haunted by the dead. It might be using the injured, the guilty, the remembered, setting them, curing them, turning memory into material. There was another note clipped into the journal, this one typed on company letterhead with no signature. Containment capacity in Silo 4 nearing threshold. Recommend temporary shutdown following next serious event. No shutdown happened. The production records continued uninterrupted for years, which meant one of 2 things. Either the threat assessment was nonsense, or the company had decided whatever lived here was cheaper to manage than to stop. I found one more thing before dawn forced me back to regular work. Folded into the rear cover was a rough map of the plant with old quarry boundaries drawn underneath in red pencil. Silo 4 sat directly over a sealed vertical access shaft leading into the collapsed lower galleries. Not adjacent to it. Over it. That was no design coincidence. When I met Ron at shift change, I watched him differently. He looked more tired than usual, but then again we all did. Gray dust in the creases of his neck. Coffee in a paper cup. Oil stain on one knee. You knew about the collapse, I said. He didn't play dumb. Everybody here knows about the collapse. I found records. That was your first mistake. I almost snapped at him, but kept my voice level. Silo 4 is on top of the old shaft. Ron said nothing. And the rules, I said. They're not about employee safety. They're about containment. At that, he looked at me in a way I hadn't seen before. Not annoyed. Not smug. Just tired. Containment makes it sound organized, he said. What is it, then? He rubbed a hand over his mouth. A habit. I stared at him. The place had an accident, he said. Then another after that. And every time the people left standing made a rule to survive the next one. That's how habits start. That doesn't explain the gray workers. No, he said quietly. That explains us. Before I could press him, the intercom in the corridor above the locker room crackled awake. There was a hiss of static. Then a woman's voice I didn't recognize said, "Maintenance to Mixer 3. Ron closed his eyes. It was such a small reaction, but it changed the whole room. Because I had never told him which rule I broke. He opened his eyes again and said, "If you hear an apology tonight, don't stay to listen." That wasn't on any list I'd seen. He walked away before I could ask why. I stood there holding the journal inside my jacket, the old quarry map folded against my ribs, and for the first time I understood that the rules weren't there because anybody was in control. They were there because control had already failed. After that, the official rules stopped working the way rules are supposed to work. Or maybe they never had, and I had just reached the part where the exceptions begin. The gray workers changed first. Before, they had mostly watched. Still figures at the edge of catwalks and doorways, more disturbing for their patience than for anything they actively did. But once I started digging through records, once I started thinking of them as connected to the collapse, the accidents, my own memory, they seemed to get bolder. One appeared in the maintenance shop, standing between the parts washer and the dead soda machine as if he had been there all shift. I walked in carrying a box of seals and stopped hard enough that the box hit my leg. "Mark," he said through the dust mask. Not loud, not hostile, just my name. Rule 3 said not to acknowledge workers in gray coveralls. Rule 5 said never answer your name over the intercom, not in person. The unofficial journal said acknowledgement increases persistence. Ron's notebook, as far as I'd seen, said they might be harmless if acknowledged first. There I was with 3 conflicting versions and a figure that looked, under the fluorescent lights, a little too much like my father around the shoulders. I backed out without speaking. When I looked again from the hallway, the shop was empty. That same night, wet footprints appeared in the stairwell near the quarry access door. Bare human prints in pale slurry, each one detailed enough to show the ball of the foot, the arch, the drag of a heel. They led downward. Rule 6 said follow them only if they lead outside. These led toward the quarry, which was outside technically, but only after the stairwell, the service corridor, and the caged gate. I crouched beside them and felt a stupid surge of relief when I saw they were incomplete at the edges, as if whatever had made them didn't quite understand how weight works. Then the prints changed direction while I was watching. I don't mean the old ones vanished and new ones appeared. I mean the next wet print formed facing back up toward me, blooming slowly in the dust-coated concrete as if a soaked invisible foot had just lifted away. I left immediately. By then I had started carrying a pocket notebook the way Ron did. Mine wasn't leather-bound or old, just a cheap hardware store pad that fit in my chest pocket. At first I used it to copy anything useful from the journal. Then I started writing my own observations. Not theory, just patterns. They don't always cast a shadow under sodium lamps. If a machine stops all at once, not belt slowing but all at once, hide before checking power. Freshly poured concrete in forms should be avoided after midnight even if route is longer. Surface moves before it sets. Never trust a worker who leaves no footprints in dust-heavy areas. If you hear someone apologizing for an accident you remember, run. That last one I added after the bagging line incident. It was around 2:10 in the morning. I was near the bagging area clearing a sensor fault when I heard a voice behind me say, "I'm sorry about Ohio." I knew the voice right away. Tyler Mays, the man whose hand I'd effectively signed away. I turned before I could stop myself. He stood 10 feet back by the pallet stacks in gray coveralls and a mask. But this time the empty sleeve wasn't hanging loose. It was full, solid. The outline of fingers flexed against the cloth like he'd been given back what he lost. Only wrong. "I never meant to make trouble for you," he said. My whole body went cold in a practical way. Not dramatic. My skin tightened and my knees felt unreliable. Because it had never once occurred to me, not even in my private guilt, that Tyler would apologize to me. I ran. Not far. Just out through the cross corridor and into the forklift lane, where 2 actual operators were moving wrapped pallets toward loading. I stood there trying to get control of my breathing while reverse alarms beeped and diesel fumes cut through the cement dust. When I looked back, Tyler was gone. That was the moment I finally admitted the thing inside Black Hollow learned from emotion. Fear helped it, but guilt helped it more. You can ignore a stranger easier than you can ignore somebody connected to the worst thing you ever did. That seemed to be the whole strategy. It didn't need to scare people with monsters. It just needed to become the shape of whatever would make you hesitate. Once I saw that pattern, other pieces started fitting. The masks were not for anonymity. They were for gradual recognition, a slow reveal. The contradictory rules weren't random. They reflected changes in behavior, adaptations. What worked on one version of the thing stopped working once it had learned enough from prior encounters. And the factory management. Mercer, his father before him, whoever else had passed down those laminated cards, hadn't been protecting us so much as slowing a process they didn't know how to stop. Ron and I started talking more after that, though talking is generous. Mostly we traded observations in short bursts between jobs like men discussing whether neither of us could change. He admitted he'd seen different rule versions over the years. "They shift after bad incidents," he said. "How bad?" "Bad enough that the county sheriff stops using first names." He also told me there had once been a rule about mirrors. Then there hadn't. Then there had been again. Same with whistles, radios, open water, and dust masks removed indoors. "Why not just shut the place down?" I asked. Ron gave me a look like I was 12. People tried. Men with numbers and ties came in. They toured. They made plans. Then production got busy and somebody got hurt somewhere else and the costs changed shape. That's all shutting down ever is. A cost with a different face. There was anger in that, but also shame. I recognized both because I carried plenty of both myself. By the end of the week, I had 6 pages of notes and almost no sleep. I also started noticing that some gray workers were more solid than others. A few seemed washed out, unfinished, fuzzy at the edges where dust crossed them. Others were real enough to block light, leave marks, bump hanging chains. Those were the ones linked to stronger memories. Those were the ones getting closer. I kept one final rule for myself after a near miss in the quarry. I was out there with a flashlight checking a stalled aggregate feeder at 3:07 a.m. when I realized I could hear footsteps crunching behind me in the limestone gravel. More than one set. 2 coordinated to be wind or shifting stone. Rule 7 said not to remain alone in the quarry after 3 in the morning. I wasn't alone. That turned out to be worse. When I turned, there were 5 gray workers spread along the hall road. All of them wearing dust masks and coveralls filmed with pale powder. One was Ron's height. One had my father's stance. One, impossibly, had Tyler's recovered hand hanging loose at his side. None of them moved toward me. They just waited, like they had arrived at the edge of some understanding and wanted to see whether I had too. I backed toward the gate without looking away. When I reached the chain link opening, I wrote my last new rule in the notebook with a shaking hand. If the rules begin to make sense, you are already too close. The next night, the whole plant went silent. And Black Hollow showed me what it had been building. Factories are never completely quiet unless something is wrong. Even shutdown has its own sounds. Cooling metal, air purge, drip, hum, settling strain. There is always some leftover noise, some mechanical afterthought. So when Black Hollow went still all at once just after 1:30 in the morning, every part of me knew it before my radio even crackled. The conveyors stopped. The kiln rumble died. Fans wound down. Then came the worst part. The dust that usually drifted with airflow just hung where it was, suspended, as if the whole plant had forgotten which way gravity worked. My radio burst with voices stepping on each other. Line 2 dead. Who killed main feed? Can anyone hear me at the south? Then Mercer's voice cut through, sharper than I'd ever heard it. All-night personnel report to Silo 4 immediately. Repeat, all-night personnel to Silo 4. Now. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. Rule 1 sat in my head like a nail. Never enter Silo 4 after midnight. Yet, the manager himself was ordering everybody there. Around me, workers had emerged into the main corridor from side rooms and platforms, all wearing the same expression. Not confusion, exactly. Recognition. No one argued. That scared me more than the silence. Ron appeared at the end of the passage near the control booth. He moved fast for a man his age, one hand gripping the rail. "Did you hear that?" I said, unnecessary as it was. He nodded once. "It's full." "What's full?" He looked straight at me. That should have sent me running in the opposite direction. Instead, I went with the flow of men heading toward the silo sector, because there are moments when the body chooses the crowd even if the mind knows the crowd is heading somewhere bad. Silo 4 sat apart from the others on the older side of the plant, beyond a service lane and a rusting row of aggregate hoppers no one used anymore. Its access door had always been locked on my shifts. That night it stood open. Mercer waited outside with 2 supervisors I barely knew. He looked older than he had in his office the first day, not because time had passed but because some private collapse had finally become visible. "Inside," he said as we approached. "What the hell is this?" one of the forklift guys asked. Mercer ignored him. There were maybe 15 of us on night shift that night, not counting security. I only saw 12 going in. I don't know where the others were. I'm not sure I want to know. The interior of Silo 4 was wider than I expected and colder than it should have been. A circular chamber with service ladders, inspection platforms, and a central floor space that had clearly been modified from its original industrial purpose. Heavy bracing had been added. Old injection lines ran into the walls. Spotlights faced inward from the catwalks. It wasn't a storage silo anymore. It was a vault. And the walls, even now that's the part my mind resists first. Thousands of handprints covered the inner concrete in overlapping layers, all sizes, all directions, some sunken into the wall as if pressed from within, others raised and fresh-looking, damp around the edges. There were fingerprints visible in some of them, broken nails in others. One high up along the curve looked like a child's hand, though no child should ever have been in that place. Men around me swore. One backed into the doorframe and nearly fell. In the center of the silo floor stood a column of hardened gray material about 7 feet tall and broad at the shoulders, shaped like a human form only if you glanced too quickly. Up close it was worse. It bulged in places, receded in others. Faces surfaced from it in half-relief, some stretched, some calm, some with mouths open in silent speech. Arms appeared to be folding into torsos. Hands reached from chests. One section looked like 3 bodies fused hip to hip. It wasn't one person. It was accumulation. The gray workers I had been seeing were never the whole thing. They were pieces drying at the edges. Mercer spoke into the silence, and I got the feeling he was reciting words inherited from men he resented. "Stay near the wall. Don't address it. Don't respond if it addresses you. We are waiting for daylight and county containment." "County what?" somebody said. Mercer kept going like he hadn't heard. No one believed that. You could feel disbelief moving around the room like a smell. But disbelief didn't change the sight in front of us. Ron came to stand beside me. "You knew," I said. "Not all of it." "Bullshit." He didn't deny it. "I knew enough." The thing in the middle of the floor made a sound then. Not a roar. Not anything theatrical. More like trapped air shifting through wet material. Several faces along its surface moved at once, as if trying on expression. One of the younger laborers to my left said, very softly. "Those are people," Mercer said. "Were." That broke whatever thin obedience the room had left. The forklift guy lunged for him. "You kept us working here?" Two others started shouting over each other. Someone demanded to know what was under the silo. Someone else said the door should never have been opened. Mercer didn't defend himself. He just watched the thing as though argument had become a luxury. Then the central mass turned. Not the whole base. The upper portion, in a slow grind, aligning one cluster of faces toward us. And I saw Tyler. Not perfectly, not complete, but there, above a shoulder-like rise, his mouth, his brow, the beginning of that same slanted nose. Nearby, impossible and worse, was a face I recognized from the framed photos upstairs. Cormac, the night supervisor from the old logs. Another face beside his looked enough like Ron that I felt my stomach drop. I looked at Ron. He wouldn't look back. That was when I understood he had been surviving longer than he should have, and survival in Black Hollow was never clean. "How many accidents?" I asked him. He answered too slowly. "Enough." The thing's surface rippled. Then from somewhere above us, the intercom speaker mounted near the catwalk hissed alive. It used my voice. "Mark," it said, almost gentle. "You can come closer." Every head in the room turned toward me. I had never told anyone the details. Not Mercer. Not Ron. Nobody here knew why my past mattered to a thing built from industrial dead and unfinished guilt. But Black Hollow knew. Maybe it had known the first day Mercer looked at my file and hired me too fast. The central mass shifted again, and several gray flakes broke from its surface, hit the floor, and rose as human shapes before my eyes. Half-formed workers, coveralls, masks, shoulders filling out like wet casts taking structure. Fragments separating from the body they came from. One of them lifted its head toward me. Tyler's voice came from behind the mask. "You don't have to keep being sorry." The room came apart after that. A laborer bolted for the door. Another started praying. Someone threw a wrench that sank into the gray mass up to the handle and was slowly absorbed, metal disappearing as if pushed into deep mortar. Mercer grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. "If it's talking to you, do not answer." "What is it?" I said. He looked at the mass, then at the handprints, then at the floor beneath us. Everything we didn't stop. It wasn't a scientific answer. It wasn't even a useful one. But standing in Silo 4 with the faces of the dead pushing outward and my own voice waiting in the speaker above, I knew it was the most honest thing anyone in management had ever said. The thing had been built by collapse, sealed by procedure, fed by accidents, and shaped by memory. And it had almost finished curing. Once the fragments started separating from the main body in Silo 4, the old rules stopped mattering because the place could no longer pretend they were enough. Gray workers peeled away from the central mass and from the walls themselves, stepping out of fresh handprints with wet sounds that I can still hear if I wake up wrong. Some were only partial, one arm unfinished, a shoulder sloughing dust, a face too flat. Others looked fully solid, enough that when they moved across the floor they left prints and shifted small debris. The men near the door surged and jammed it immediately. That was the first real panic. Not screaming exactly. Industrial panic is uglier than movie panic. It's men swearing, shoving, trying to apply procedure to something that won't respect it. One worker grabbed a fire extinguisher off the wall and blasted a gray figure full in the chest. The powder hit, clouded, and then fell straight through as if the body was only half decided. Mercer climbed the lower ladder platform and started shouting for everyone to stay off the center floor. Nobody listened because nobody knew what that meant anymore. I backed along the wall with Ron, trying to keep both the door and the main mass in sight. "What happens at daylight?" I asked him. "If it hasn't fully set, it weakens." "And if it has?" He didn't answer. That was answer enough. The intercom crackled again. This time it wasn't only my voice. It cycled through others. A woman crying. A foreman barking instructions. Somebody coughing badly. Tyler again. Then my own voice returned, calm and near. "Mark, you came here because you were tired of carrying it." A gray worker stepped out from the ring of others. He wore no mask. He was me. Not perfectly. Too pale. As a shade wrong. But enough that several men glanced from him to me and back. I felt something in my chest go hollow. "You signed," he said. That was all. Men sign things every day. I didn't answer. He smiled with my mouth. "You thought being sorry was honorable. It isn't. It's just inefficient." Behind him, more figures emerged. One with Tyler's face. One with my father's. One that resembled Nate from high school. One, sickeningly, wearing Ron's features from 20 years younger. The thing understood persuasion now. Not just fright. Mercer shouted from the platform, "Do not engage!" Then a gray worker at his back turned and put both hands on his shoulders. Mercer screamed once as those hands hardened around him like setting plaster. Men rushed the ladder. The platform rail snapped under the weight. Everybody moved at once, and in that burst of confusion I saw something important. The fragments hesitated. Not at fear. At unpredictability. One forklift operator swung the extinguisher wildly, not as a weapon but just panicked movement, and two gray workers flinched away as if they hadn't expected it. Another laborer kicked over a toolbox that scattered sockets and bolts across the floor, and three fragments turned toward the noise like dogs losing a scent. It didn't know chaos well. It knew habits, guilt, repetition, rehearsed responses, rules. That was when the shape of a plan started forming. Not a good plan, just a possible one. Black Hollow sat beside an unstable old quarry. The plant kept emergency charges and controlled demolition equipment for handling certain blockage scenarios in the older aggregate structures. I knew where the manual triggers were for the backup collapse sequence near the sealed lower shaft because I had helped inspect the panel 2 weeks earlier. It wasn't meant for total destruction. Just containment if the old galleries shifted again. Silo 4 was built over the shaft. If the bracing under it failed, I looked at Ron. He must have seen something on my face because he said, "No, it doesn't handle surprise well. It'll bury everyone. It'll bury this too." He grabbed my sleeve. "You don't know that." "No," I said. "I know the rules didn't stop it." The me-shaped fragment took another step closer. "You're still trying to make it a lesson," he said. "It doesn't have to be. Come here. We can take the weight off." Some part of me responded to that. I hate admitting it, but I have to. For one stretched, awful moment, the offer sounded merciful. No more replaying Ohio. No more waking at noon with the same pit in my stomach. No more measuring every new failure against the old one. Just release. That was probably how Black Hollow kept people close all those years. Not by threatening them. By offering to absolve them in the shape of surrender. Then Tyler's face surfaced beside the false me and said, in a voice that was almost his but not enough, "I forgive you," and that fixed it for me. Because Tyler had never been required to forgive me. That wasn't something I was owed. Hearing the thing use forgiveness like bait made the whole offer cheap and ugly. I tore the laminated rules card off my belt and let it fall. Then I did the opposite of everyone I could manage. I stepped toward Silo 4 Center after midnight. I looked directly at the gray workers and said, "I see you." I grabbed the wall radio mic and answered when the intercom called my name. "Yes," I said. "I hear you." The fragments paused. The whole room seemed to tilt around that pause. Chaos moved through them. Confusion, if confusion can exist in something made of memory and cement dust. Because rules create expectation, and expectation is a kind of path. Stepping off it mattered. I ran. Not for the door. For the maintenance hatch at the rear service ladder that connected to the lower bracing corridor beneath the silo floor. I knew the route. Narrow steel stairs, utility conduit, old panel box with a plastic cover that never sat right. Behind me, people were shouting. Someone called my name, human or not, I still don't know. Ron yelled once. The intercom erupted in overlapping voices. I hit the hatch shoulder first, slammed into the corridor below, and almost slipped on the dust-caked grating. The lights down there flickered with backup power, giving everything a sick yellow pulse. I heard pounding overhead as fragments moved across the floor above me. The control collapse panel sat at the end of the bracing hall, Red cover plate sealed with a wire tag. I ripped the tag free. A voice behind me said, "Mark." My own voice again. Closer now. Not from a speaker. I turned. The me-shaped fragment had followed into the corridor, but it didn't move quite right in the tight space, like it had been built for rooms larger than a human body. The shoulders brushed the conduit. Dust sifted down where its head passed the low crossbeam. "You think this makes you better?" it asked. "No," I said, and meant it. That seemed to confuse it more than anger would have. I flipped the cover. Emergency instructions glared up at me in faded block text. Sequence key. Arm switch. Delay. Manual trigger. The fragment came closer. Behind it, farther back in the corridor, I saw Ron. He had one hand pressed to his side. Blood or slurry or something dark soaked through his shirt, but he was still standing. "Do it," he said. The fragment turned toward him too slowly. I armed the panel. The warning klaxon failed to sound. Either the system was too old or power was too unstable. Good. Surprise mattered. The me-shaped thing lunged. Ron hit it from the side with a pry bar, not to kill it. Maybe it couldn't be killed that way, but to change its path. That tiny act of bad timing was enough. I slammed the trigger. For half a second nothing happened. Then the world below the silo gave way. The sound wasn't an explosion. More like several giant things deciding to stop holding each other up. Steel screamed. Concrete cracked in layers. Dust punched through the corridor so hard it took the light with it. I remember falling. I remember Ron shouting something I never heard cleanly. I remember a pressure change so sudden it felt like the quarry had opened its mouth underneath us. Then everything dropped. And for the first time since I arrived at Black Hollow, the thing inside it could not predict what the people around it would do next. That was the only advantage we ever had. It just wasn't enough to save the factory. Officially, Black Hollow Cement closed because of a structural failure triggered by subsurface instability in an abandoned quarry system. That was the language used in the county report. Structural failure, instability, legacy excavation issues. There were diagrams, statements, recovery updates, environmental assessments. Insurance people came through. State people came through. The company put out a careful notice full of condolences and cooperation. No report mentioned Silo 4 as containment. No report mentioned gray workers. No report mentioned handprints in the inner wall or voices on dead intercoms or the fact that the collapse seemed to begin from the inside out, as if the plant had finally caved around something it could no longer hold. A few bodies were recovered. Not all of them. Mercer was listed among the dead. Ron Haskell was listed as missing, presumed deceased. I told the county deputy that if they found him, he might still have notes worth reading. The deputy wrote that down like it was a courtesy and then never contacted me again. I survived with a cracked rib, a torn shoulder, and enough dust in my lungs that I coughed gray for weeks. People asked whether I planned to leave Mercer's Run. I said yes at first. Then I didn't. I rented the same duplex another 3 months. Then 6. I found day work 2 towns over doing equipment checks for an aggregate yard. Boring, clean by comparison, and almost insultingly normal. I should have been grateful. Instead, I started driving past the Black Hollow site once every week or so. I told myself I was checking the fence line because I didn't trust the company to keep people out. That was part of it. Kids would absolutely dare each other onto a place like that. Scrappers too. The real reason was simpler and worse. I wanted proof it was over. At first the quarry looked dead enough to satisfy anyone else. The main stack had been cut down. The loading bay doors were chained. Most of the south wall had pancaked inward, leaving only chunks of upright structure and twisted conveyor runs hanging over the pit. Rain collected in the broken lower yard. Weeds began taking hold in the gravel. But dead industrial sites don't usually feel attentive. This one did. The first few drives passed without incident. A locked gate, whined through fence slats, warning placards flapping loose. I almost let myself believe burial had worked where rules hadn't. Then, in late October, I saw movement along the quarry rim. At first I thought it was cleanup crews. There were enough trucks and temporary barriers in the first month that it would have made sense. I pulled onto the shoulder and cut the engine for a better look. No trucks. No equipment. Just figures. Gray coveralls. Dust masks. Walking in single file along the upper edge of the collapsed quarry where the old haul road used to run. Slow, deliberate, too many to count quickly. Dozens at least. Maybe hundreds farther back in the morning haze. None of them stumbled on the broken ground. None of them looked at one another. Every one of them faced the same direction, moving toward the section of fence nearest the road where the old security gate still stood. I stayed in the truck with both hands on the wheel. The heater ticked. My coffee had gone cold in the cup holder. I remember those details because the mind gets petty when it can't afford bigger thoughts. Then I noticed fresh spray paint on the rusted gate. It hadn't been there the week before. White letters, shaky but legible, across the old no trespassing sign. Rule 8. If the factory ever apologizes, do not forgive it. I got out then. I'm not proud of that either. Some part of me needed to stand close enough to know it was real paint on real metal and not some message arranged for me in dust and nerves. The ground beside the gate was muddy from recent rain. There were footprints, not shoe prints, bare ones. They led from inside the fence to the shoulder of the road and stopped a few feet from my truck, as if someone had walked out during the night, stood there considering me, and then simply ceased to exist. I backed away from the gate. That was when the old intercom speaker mounted above the security shack crackled to life. There was no power on site. The utility feeds had been cut after the collapse. I knew that for a fact because I had watched crews do it. Still, the speaker hissed. Then my own voice came through, faint with static, older somehow, tired in a way I already recognized. "Mark," it said. "I think I understand what happened now." I couldn't move. Cars passed once in a while on the road behind me, ordinary traffic going between ordinary towns, and none of them slowed. None of them noticed the voices or the figures on the rim or the way the morning air over the quarry seemed to hold too much dust for a place that had been shut for months. "I didn't mean it," my voice said from beneath the collapsed plant. "You know that matters." The line went quiet. Then, very softly, from somewhere deep under the broken limestone, I heard 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. I got in the truck and left. I wish I could tell you I never went back. I wish I could tell you I handed all of this to the police, the county, a newspaper, a priest, anybody. But this is the part nobody likes in stories like this. Surviving doesn't make you brave, and understanding something doesn't make other people capable of understanding it with you. So I wrote it down instead. Everything I could remember. The rules Mercer gave me. Ron's contradictions. The journal. The handprints. The offer. The apology. Especially the apology. Because I think that was always the final trick. Not fear. Not punishment. Permission. A place like Black Hollow doesn't want to be hated forever. It wants to be excused. It wants the living to call what happened unfortunate and inevitable and over with. It wants one decent man with enough guilt to say it wasn't all your fault. I signed something once because I wanted a difficult truth to become easier. I'm not signing anything for that place again. If this account reaches anyone assigned to the property, anyone considering reopening the quarry, salvaging the structures, or running utilities through the old lower shaft, take the warning exactly as written. Do not forgive a thing that learns from being forgiven. And if you ever hear your own voice coming from underground, asking for one more chance, understand that it already knows what shape of mercy you're most likely to offer. That's how it gets solid. That's how it finishes curing.